You filed the complaint about your coworker. You documented the missed deadlines, forwarded the email chains, and carefully outlined the repeated mistakes. You sat through meetings where everyone quietly acknowledged the same problem, nodding in agreement as if resolution were inevitable. And then, nothing happened. No formal warning, no performance plan, no restructuring of responsibility, just acknowledgement. Maybe a neutral, "We'll address it as the behavior continues." If you've experienced this, you probably questioned yourself first. You assumed there must be context you weren't aware of. Maybe leadership knew something you didn't. Maybe there were constraints, political dynamics, private conversations happening behind closed doors. You tried to rationalize it, but the explanation is simpler than you think. Some employees are not evaluated primarily on how well they perform. They are evaluated on how disruptive they would be to remove. That is the rule that rarely gets spoken out loud. When you escalate an issue, you believe you are asking for accountability. You believe you are pointing out inefficiency or misconduct that threatens the organization. What you are actually doing is asking someone above you to accept additional work. Termination requires documentation. Documentation requires time. Time requires managerial focus. Focus requires trade-offs. And managerial focus is limited. Every time you escalated the problem, leadership ran a calculation, not a moral calculation, not a fairness calculation, but a workload calculation. If we remove this person, who absorbs their tasks tomorrow? If we initiate corrective action, how many meetings does it trigger? If we terminate them and the replacement struggles, who bears the fallout? If legal review becomes necessary, who sits through those calls? If the removal process creates more immediate burden than tolerating the dysfunction, tolerance becomes the rational choice. Not because the employee is excellent, but because removal is expensive. You interpreted inaction as protection. It was preservation of convenience. That distinction changes how you interpret everything else. You may have also noticed that the underperformer rarely receives the same intensity of scrutiny that you do. They miss deadlines repeatedly. They generate avoidable problems. They create confusion that others clean up. Yet the consequences feel mild. Meanwhile, you made a single mistake and received immediate correction. That inconsistency feels personal. It isn't. It is expectation calibration. Reliable employees create high expectations. Unreliable employees normalize low ones. When you consistently deliver strong performance, that level becomes the baseline. Any deviation stands out sharply. It violates expectation. But when someone consistently underperforms, leadership adapts to that baseline. Small improvements feel like progress. Continued mediocrity feels stable. Stability is easier to manage than correction. You are being measured against the standard you created, while they are being measured against the standard leadership allowed. And allowed standards tend to persist. Over time, you likely adjusted, you stopped escalating, you double-checked their work, you filled in gaps, you rerouted critical tasks away from them, you absorbed responsibility quietly so the team would not suffer. You believed you were protecting performance. Operationally, you were. Structurally, you were shielding leadership from feeling the consequences of their tolerance. Leadership responds when dysfunction reaches them directly. If you intercept it and compensate, the urgency disappears. A problem that never creates executive discomfort rarely receives executive intervention, and so the pattern reinforces itself. The underperformer survives not because they are indispensable. They survive because removing them would require managerial energy. Energy is scarce. Scarcity drives decision-making. Now apply this logic to restructuring and layoffs. When budgets tighten, leadership does not begin by asking who works hardest. They begin by asking who creates disruption if removed, who holds undocumented knowledge, Who maintains fragile vendor relationships? Who operates legacy systems no one else understands? Who, if eliminated tomorrow, causes immediate operational instability? You interpreted tolerance as favoritism. Often, it is avoidance. Avoidance reduces immediate burden. Now consider expectation management again. When you consistently deliver excellence, you raise the operational bar, and leadership becomes dependent on your reliability. Dependency feels like security, but dependency in a cost-focused environment creates vulnerability. If you are reliable and documented, your work becomes transferable. Transferable work is easier to reassign. If someone else's work is messy, undocumented, and siloed, their removal feels risky. You optimize for efficiency. They optimized, consciously or not, for extraction resistance. Extraction resistance creates insulation. That inversion feels unfair, but it aligns with managerial incentives. Now revisit HR complaints. When you file a complaint, you believe you are escalating misconduct. Leadership evaluates it through a different lens. Does resolving this issue generate significant administrative work? Does it create legal review? Does it require formal documentation cycles? Does it introduce upward scrutiny? If the behavior is disruptive but containable, it may be deprioritized. Containable issues rarely outrank disruptive ones. You believed you were escalating a principle. They evaluated a cost. This pattern extends into promotions and restructuring. The employee who hoards information gains leverage. The employee who shares information gains portability. The employee who introduces reform increases oversight requirements. The employee who maintains predictable dysfunction reduces disruption. Managers often prefer predictable problems over unpredictable reform. Reform requires coordination. Coordination requires meetings. Meetings require time. Time competes with other priorities. Predictable dysfunction can be tolerated quietly. Unpredictable improvement demands attention. Attention is rationed. This does not mean performance is irrelevant. It means performance is one variable in a broader optimization model. Leadership protects what creates upward disruption. They correct what creates downward frustration. Those are not the same triggers. Downward frustration is absorbed. Upward disruption escalates. You are measuring value in contribution. Leadership was measuring value in inconvenience. Different metrics produce different outcomes. Once you understand that, previous events align. The complaint that disappeared was evaluated against administrative burden. The promotion that bypassed competence favored embedded relationships. The layoff that eliminated strong performers reduced roles that were easiest to consolidate. What felt irrational was workload optimization. Organizations optimize for minimizing managerial strain. They protect roles that would create immediate executive burden if removed. They reduce roles that create operational frustration, but minimal upward chaos. The untouchable employee survives because removing them creates work for someone above them. You may have also noticed another pattern. Underperformers often control informal networks. They have long-standing relationships with vendors, clients, or legacy staff. They may not excel in execution, but they possess institutional memory. Institutional memory creates friction during transition. Friction increases risk perception. Risk perception influences retention decisions. Meanwhile, you may have built systems that reduced friction. You streamlined processes. You documented procedures. You automated workflows. You trained colleagues. Those actions improved efficiency. They also reduce transition risk. Reduced transition risk makes consolidation easier. You optimize for organizational health. They optimize for personal insulation. This does not mean you should become inefficient. It means you should understand the structural incentives at play. If insulation comes from friction, you can decide how integrated you want to be. If documentation increases portability, you can decide how replaceable your role appears. If absorbing dysfunction reduces pressure on leadership, you can decide when to stop compensating. Understanding the rule allows strategic adjustment. The untouchable employee is rarely untouchable because no one sees their flaws. Everyone sees them. They are untouchable because touching them requires energy. Leadership prefers to conserve. Energy conservation drives more decisions than fairness does. Fairness is discussed. Convenience is calculated. In systems under constraint, calculation dominates. The next time you observe someone surviving repeated failures, do not ask whether leadership approves of their behavior. Ask whether removing them would create immediate work for someone above them. If the answer is yes, their insulation strengthens. If the answer is no, their vulnerability increases. That question predicts survival more accurately than performance metrics ever will. The system is not random, it is optimized. Optimized for workload distribution, optimized for minimizing upward disruption, optimized for preserving managerial capacity. And inside that optimization, the employee who creates the least additional burden for leadership often carries the most protection. Once you understand that rule, confusion fades. It does not make outcomes fair, but it makes them legible. And once a system becomes legible, you stop personalizing its outcomes. You start analyzing them. Analysis creates leverage. Leverage creates optionality. Optionality restores control. The untouchable employee is not protected by invisibility. They are protected by inconvenience. And inconvenience in most organizations carries more weight than merit ever will.